I watched the thing pace us along the moonlit shingle, its pallor almost luminous against the black Baltic water. The wind cut through my coat as though it were paper, yet the air around it seemed quite still. Its gait was wrong, too measured, as if imitating a man from memory alone. Each time our lanterns swung away, it drew closer, until I saw its hands were quite bare of colour. Men have asked me to set down this occurrence, though I have long doubted the wisdom of troubling others with it. If you would hear more such accounts and lend your own thoughts, I would be obliged if you sign your name in the comments below and subscribe by whatever means you follow such tales. To understand what we faced upon that coast, I must return to the beginning, when the matter was only a question of sand, stone, and theodolites. I was then a junior surveyor attached to the Danish Geodetic Institute, 30 years of age, and still harbouring the conviction that the world could be measured into submission. In May of 1908, we were dispatched from Copenhagen to the west coast of Jutland to refine coastal charts between Videsande and Nymindegab, where shifting sandbanks and storms had rendered the Admiralty's older soundings uncertain. We travelled by rail to Ringkøbing and then by hired cart to the low, wind-scoured dunes that faced the North Sea. Our party numbered 4. There was Chief Surveyor Rasmussen, a taciturn man of 50 with a great grey moustache and a reputation for exactitude. Peterson, my senior by some years, broad of shoulder and prone to laughter, was in charge of the plane table work. Young Anderson, scarcely 20, served as assistant and porter, with me between them in age and responsibility. We brought with us 2 brass theodolites in fitted oak cases, plane tables, tripods, chains, a prismatic compass, barometer, field books, and a small chest of chemical lamps and spare mantles. Our rifles, 2 Krag-Jørgensen carbines, came more from habit than expectation of use. That portion of the coast was known more for wrecks and smugglers than for any dangerous beasts. The first days passed as such work generally does. We established a baseline upon the firm sand above the high-water mark, drove in pickets, and began the slow business of angles and distances. The weather was fair, though the wind seldom relented. The sea roared without cease, a constant white fringe upon the horizon. Gulls wheeled and cried over the surf, and the sand rasped against our boots. The first oddity did not at once strike me as such. On the 3rd morning, as we broke our fast upon rye bread and salt pork, Anderson remarked that he had heard someone walking outside the tent during the night. "A fisherman, perhaps," I said. "These coasts are full of them." He shook his head. No voice, no light, just steps in the sand, there and then there again. He pointed, indicating a path that seemed to circle our little encampment. Peterson laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "You dreamt it, boy. The sea puts footfalls in a man's head if he listens too long." I accepted that explanation readily enough. At that time, I still believed all things could be so explained. That afternoon, while sighting along the coast, I noticed what appeared to be footprints upon the wet sand below the dune. They ran parallel to the waterline for some distance, then veered inland toward the marram grass. They were bare, human in outline, yet peculiarly long, as if the heel had been drawn out. The stride was even, too even, each impression set at almost identical intervals. I called to Rasmussen. He glanced down, squinting against the glare. "Bathing," he said. "Some fool from the village. Mark the station, Nielsen. We lose the light." I wrote it in my field book, out of habit rather than conviction. Bare tracks upon shore, likely bather. Only later would I wish I had drawn them more exactly. Our camp lay in a shallow between two low dunes, perhaps 100 paces from the sea. Behind us stretched heath and scattered pines, with a few poor farms further inland. The nearest village, Sundevik, lay several kilometers to the north. We saw its smoke sometimes, but seldom its people. On the fifth evening, after a day of triangulation between improvised signals upon the dunes, we sat by our small paraffin lamp and shared tobacco. The wind had dropped somewhat, and the sea's roar seemed more distant. Peterson spoke of his wife in Aarhus, who was expecting their first child come autumn. He carried in his pocket a small folded photograph of her, which he showed us with a shy pride. Anderson told us of his mother's bakery in Odense, and how the smell of warm rye bread would wake him before dawn. Even Rasmussen softened enough to admit that he longed, in his quieter moments, for his little garden behind the Institute, where he grew roses unsuited to our climate. "And you, Nielsen?" Peterson asked. "What do you do when you are not measuring the world into lines and numbers?" I hesitated, embarrassed by the smallness of my own life beside theirs. "I read," I said. "Mostly reports, accounts of other expeditions. Nansen, Nordenskjöld, men who have gone where maps are still white." "Ahat," said Peterson, smiling. "You would have joined them had you been born sooner." I said that perhaps I would. At that time, I believed it. That night, the wind rose again, and with it, a strange quality in the sound of the sea. I woke near midnight, feeling the canvas of the tent shudder against my face, and heard, beneath the deep crash of waves, a sequence of lighter sounds. They were not the random clatter of shells or driftwood, but a pattern, like steps upon packed sand. 3 together, a pause, then 3 again. I lay still, listening. The hair upon my arms prickled, though I could not have said why. After some minutes, the sound ceased, or perhaps was swallowed by the wind. I told myself it had been some trick of the air within the guy ropes, and eventually slept. In the morning, I found, just beyond the edge of our camp, a series of impressions in the sand. They were not clear, for the wind had already begun to soften their edges, but I could see that they followed a circle around our tents at a distance of perhaps 10 paces. Each mark was elongated as I had seen before upon the shore, and set at that same curiously regular interval. "Anderson," I called, "your fisherman returned." He came, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and frowned down at the prince. "He did not come nearer," he said. "No," I answered, "he did not." Rasmussen dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Enough of this. The Institute does not pay us to chase phantoms in the sand, to work." We obeyed. Yet I noticed that Anderson, as he carried the plane table up the dune, glanced more often than before toward the empty shore. As the days lengthened, the work drew us further along the coast. We established secondary camps, rough windbreaks of sailcloth and poles, and left our main tents standing in the hollow. It was on one of these excursions, about 2 weeks into the survey, that the second anomaly occurred. We had been measuring a line between 2 headlands, the sea on our left and a belt of stunted pines on our right. The sky was low and grey, and a fine salt mist clung to every metal surface. The work was tedious but straightforward. I recall that I was thinking of nothing more uncanny than the stiffness in my shoulders. It was then that the sound changed. The sea did not cease, but it seemed to draw back, as if heard through a door that had been partly closed. In its place came a hush so complete that for a moment I thought some wax had lodged in my ears. The cries of the gulls, so constant that one ceased to hear them, were suddenly absent. I stopped, the chain in my hands, and looked about. The others had halted as well. The only sound was our own breathing and the faint clink of metal as the chain settled. "Do you hear that?" I said. "Hear what?" asked Peterson, but his voice was low. "Nothing," I answered. "That is the point." Even as I spoke, the wind returned, hard enough to sting my eyes with blown sand. The gulls cried overhead as if they had never ceased. The sea's roar swelled once more against the dunes. For a moment I wondered whether I had imagined the silence, but I saw in the others' faces that they had felt it too. Rasmussen cleared his throat. "A change in the air pressure," he said. "These coasts are full of such tricks. Back to it." We resumed our work, though I found myself glancing more often toward the line where the dunes met the sky. Once, I thought I saw a figure there, pale against the darker sand, but when I raised my field glass, there was nothing. That evening, as we returned to camp, we found our main tent partially unpegged on the seaward side. The canvas flapped and snapped in the wind, and one of the guy ropes had come loose. "Curse this wind," said Peterson, bending to drive the peg in again. Yet the peg itself was not where it should have been. It lay some distance off, as if it had been drawn up and laid carefully aside. The rope showed no sign of fraying, nor did the surrounding sand bear the usual scuff marks of a man's boot. "Children from the village?" suggested Anderson, though his tone was uncertain. "Children would have taken something," said Rasmussen. He checked the crates of instruments, the food chest, our rifles. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been disturbed within. I took up the peg and turned it in my hand. The wood was dry, unweathered. It had not been wrenched out by force, but drawn straight up. That night, we set an extra lamp outside the tent, its mantle hissing softly in the dark. The flame made a small circle of light upon the sand, beyond which the night pressed in. We took turns at watch, though none of us would have admitted that was what we did. I sat the second watch, from midnight until 2. The sea's mutter was a constant presence, like the breathing of some great animal. The wind plucked at the guy ropes and rattled the tin mug I had left upon a crate. The lamp's flame bent and straightened, bent and straightened. Somewhere beyond its circle, I heard a sound, faint but distinct, a soft, measured tread upon the sand. 3 steps, a pause, 3 more. It approached, then veered, tracing a path, I thought, around the edge of the light. "Who goes there?" I called, my hand upon the rifle beside me. The steps ceased. The wind filled the silence. I waited, every sense straining, but heard nothing more. In the morning, there were marks in the sand again, just at the limit of the lamp's reach. They were clearer this time, for the wind had dropped in the hours before dawn. Each impression showed the shape of a foot, long and narrow, with all 5 toes distinct. Yet there was something amiss in their proportions, as if the joints lay in unfamiliar places. Rasmussen looked at them a long while without speaking. At last, he said, "A prank. Some fellow from the village with more time than sense. We shall speak with them when next we go for provisions." He did not, however, suggest that we dispense with the night watches. In the days that followed, our work moved further south, toward a stretch of coast where the dunes grew higher and the beach narrowed. The weather worsened. Low, wet fogs rolled in from the sea, muffling sound, and beating upon our instruments. We lost 2 days to rain so heavy that the tent walls bowed inward. It was upon the first clear day after that storm that the matter ceased to be merely an unease and became something I could not reconcile with any natural cause. We had established a temporary station upon a particularly high dune from which we could see far along the coast in both directions. The sky was a hard enamel blue and the sea shone like beaten metal. The wind had dropped to a steady breeze. I was at the theodolite, taking a reading upon a signal flag we had planted upon a distant headland. The instrument's brass gleamed in the sun, and I remember thinking how fine it looked, like a small piece of civilization set against the wildness of sand and sea. As I bent to record the angle in my book, there came a sudden sharp crack like a pistol shot. The theodolite lurched beneath my hands. I seized it instinctively, but too late the tripod collapsed on one side and the instrument crashed into the sand. For a moment, I could not move. The others stared. "What happened?" cried Peterson, scrambling up the dune. I examined the tripod. One of the legs had split cleanly near the top, as if some tremendous force had struck it. Yet there was no mark upon the wood save the break itself, and no stone or other obstacle nearby that could have caused it. The sand was smooth all around. "Rot in the grain," said Rasmussen, but his voice lacked conviction. "We shall use the spare." He said nothing of the fact that the spare tripod, which had stood some distance away, now bore upon its leg a smear of damp sand, as if something had brushed against it. That night, as we sat over our meagre supper, the mood was subdued. The loss of the instrument, though not irreparable, was a serious matter. The Institute did not look kindly upon damaged equipment. Peterson tried to lighten the air. "When I tell my wife of this, she will say that the sea itself is jealous of our measuring rods. She will say you should take work that keeps you at home," said Anderson. "Perhaps she will be right," Peterson admitted and smiled. Yet the smile did not reach his eyes. It was toward the middle of the expedition, perhaps 3 weeks from our arrival, that the thing made itself known to us in a manner that no man could dismiss as weather, prank, or mischance. We had gone north that day, nearly to Sundevig, to repeat some measurements Rasmussen judged uncertain. The sky was overcast, the air heavy. We returned late, our boots caked with wet sand, our tempers short. As we crested the last dune before our camp, we all stopped as one. Our tents stood where we had left them. The crates were in their places. The lamp poles, the cooking pit, the stacked firewood, all appeared undisturbed. Yet the sand around the camp in a wide circle had been smoothed. I do not mean that the wind had drifted it or that some animal had passed. I mean that for a space of perhaps 20 paces in every direction, the surface of the sand was as even as if a great hand had passed over it, erasing every footprint, every scuff, every sign of our presence. Only within that circle did the marks of our camp remain, crisp and clear. The boundary between the two was sharp enough to trace with a finger. "Who has been here?" whispered Anderson. "No one," said Rasmussen. His face had gone pale beneath his windburn. "No one could do this without leaving some sign." We walked the perimeter, each of us in our own silence. Beyond the smoothed ring, the dunes bore the usual patterns of wind and drift. Within, our camp stood like an island. At one point on the seaward side, I saw that the smoothness was marred by a single line. It began at the edge of the circle and ran inward for perhaps 3 paces, then stopped. It was not a footprint, but a drag mark, as if something had drawn a long, narrow limb through the sand. "An animal," said Peterson, but he did not sound sure. "What animal walks so and erases the ground as it goes?" asked Anderson. No one answered him. We slept poorly that night. The lamp outside the tent burned until dawn, hissing softly. Once, I woke to find that the flame had dwindled to a pale blue tongue, though the reservoir was still half full. I shook the lamp and it flared again, but the glass was cold to the touch. From that night onward, we seldom spoke of the oddities we observed, yet each of us noted them in his own fashion. The gulls that rose suddenly from the shore and wheeled inland as if fleeing some presence along the waterline. The way the sea mist would sometimes gather in a narrow band just above the wet sand, leaving the dunes clear like a low, crawling wall. The faint, sour odour that would come upon the air at times, not of rot or fish, but of something long shut away from the sun. My earlier confidence, my habit of ready explanation, began to falter. I told myself that we were tired, that the monotony of the dunes and the ceaseless sea played tricks upon the mind. Yet, had that been all? Why did our instruments suffer? A week before the end of our scheduled survey, we established our final secondary camp upon a narrow spit of land that jutted into the sea, a place the fishermen called the Dead Man's Tongue, for the number of wrecks upon its outer bar. We had heard tales in Sundevik of lights seen there on stormy nights, and of a blegman, a pale man, who walked the shore when the surf was high. Such stories are common along all coasts, and I paid them little heed. Still, as we pitched our small tent upon that exposed tongue of sand, with the sea on three sides and the wind pressing hard from the west, I felt a reluctance I could not wholly attribute to the weather. We intended to remain there only 2 nights, long enough to take the necessary angles and soundings. The first day passed without incident, save for a sudden drop in temperature toward evening that set our teeth chattering, though the wind did not rise. We huddled over our lamp, our breath visible in the air, until, as abruptly as it had come, the chill receded. "It is like a cellar door opened beneath us," said Anderson, rubbing his hands. "Or a grave," muttered Peterson, so low I almost did not hear him. It was on the second night upon the Dead Man's Tongue that the encounter I spoke of at the beginning took place. The sky had cleared after sunset, leaving a hard, cold moon hanging over the sea. The tide was on the turn, the waves drawing back with a long, sucking sound. Our tent, a smaller affair than the main one, strained at its ropes. We had driven the pegs deep, but the sand there was treacherous. We had agreed to keep watch in pairs, for the place felt too exposed for one man alone. Peterson and I took the first watch, from 10 until midnight. We sat upon our crates, rifles near to hand, the lamp between us casting a small wavering circle upon the sand. For a time we spoke in low voices of ordinary things. He told me he had received a letter carried out to us by a fisherman in which his wife described the quickening of the child. I listened, grateful for the human warmth of his words. Then, as if some unseen curtain had dropped, the sea's sound diminished, just as it had on that earlier day. The roar became a murmur, then a distant sigh. The wind, which had been steady, fell away. The lamp's flames straightened. "Do you feel that?" I whispered. Peterson nodded. His hand went to his rifle without conscious thought. The silence that followed was not complete. There was still the faint lap of water upon the shore, the creak of the tent poles. Yet all the life had gone out of the night. No gull cried, no distant dog barked from the farms inland. It was as if the world were holding its breath. Then we heard the steps. They came from the direction of the waterline, a soft, deliberate tread upon the wet sand. 3 together, a pause, 3 more. They were not the random, irregular sounds of a man walking in haste, but measured, almost ceremonious. Peterson rose slowly to his feet. I did the same. The lamp between us seemed suddenly very small. The steps drew nearer, then halted just beyond the reach of the lamplight. I could see nothing there, only the pale gleam of the sand, the black band of the receding water, and, beyond, the silver path of the moon upon the sea. "Who is there?" called Peterson, his voice steady. "Show yourself." There was no answer, yet the sense of presence was so strong that my skin crawled. Then, with a deliberation that made my mouth go dry, something moved at the edge of the light. It was a hand, or something that wished to resemble one. Pale as bone, it emerged from the darkness, fingers long and too many jointed, the skin smooth and without hair. It rested lightly upon the sand, as a man might place his hand upon a table before leaning into the room. The rest of it followed. What came into the lamplight that night upon the dead man's tongue was of a height with a man, perhaps somewhat taller, but its proportions were subtly wrong. As if it had been made by one who had seen men only from a distance. Its limbs were too long in the forearm and shin, its head a little too narrow. It wore no clothing that I could see. Its skin was of that same bloodless pallor from head to foot, with no variation of tone at joints or veins. In the lamplight, it seemed almost to glow. Its face, I hesitate to use that word, yet no other will serve, was the worst. The features were arranged correctly, in the sense that there were eyes, a nose, a mouth, yet they sat upon the skull as copied rather than grown. The eyes were large and colourless, reflecting the lamplight without showing any clear pupil. The mouth was a thin line that did not quite know how to curve. It regarded us with an intentness that felt like touch. I could not say whether it breathed. The air around it seemed still, and I smelled again that faint, sour odour as of something long confined. For several heartbeats, none of us moved. My mind, trained to weigh and measure, flailed for some category in which to place it. An albino? A man diseased? Some sailor lost and starved? Yet nothing in its bearing, in the way it held its limbs as if newly acquainted with them, allowed me to accept those explanations. "Stand back," said Peterson hoarsely. He raised his rifle, but his hand shook. At the motion, the thing's head tilted, bird-like, as if considering. Then it took a step forward, into the full light. Its feet were bare, long and narrow like the prints we had seen, the toes splayed slightly, as if accustomed to some other medium than sand. Each movement was too smooth, lacking the small hesitations and adjustments of a living man. It was as though it had learned to walk by watching shadows. That broke whatever paralysis held us. I raised my own rifle, the stock rough against my cheek. "Do not," whispered a voice behind me. I started in my fixation upon the thing. I had forgotten that Anderson and Rasmussen slept only a few paces away. Yet the voice had not come from them. It had come from the pale mouth before me. The words were in Danish, but spoken in a flat, toneless way, as if repeated without understanding. The lips did not move quite in time with the sound. My finger tightened upon the trigger. Some animal part of me screamed that to fire would be to invite some worse calamity. yet to stand without action seemed equally intolerable. The decision was taken from me. A gust of wind came, sudden and strong, as if some great bellows had been worked. The lamp's flame flared, went out, and we were plunged into darkness. In that instant, as the light died, I saw the thing's head turn sharply toward the sea, as if hearing some distant call. Then there was only blackness, the roar of the wind returning in a rush, and the crash of waves much nearer than before. "Into the tent!" shouted Rasmussen, now fully awake. We stumbled backward, tripping over crates and guy ropes. I felt for a fleeting second a touch upon my sleeve, cold and dry, but whether it was the thing's hand or the flapping canvas I cannot say. Within the tent, in that cramped, flapping space, we fumbled for matches, for another lamp. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing. The canvas bowed inward and sand sifted through the seams. At last, a flame caught, feeble but sufficient to show our faces, pale and drawn. No one spoke. We listened for any sound beyond the storm, any tread upon the sand, but heard only the rage of the sea. The hours until dawn were an eternity. The tent shook and strained, and more than once we thought it would be torn away. When at last the sky paled and the wind eased, we emerged stiff and hollow-eyed. The shore had changed. The tide, driven by the storm, had bitten deep into the narrow tongue of land. Our footprints of the previous day were gone, as were any traces of the thing's approach. Only one sign remained, if sign it was. Upon the damp sand just beyond where the lamp had stood, there lay a shallow depression, elongated and smooth, as if something had rested there upon its side. We broke camp without discussion. Rasmussen gave the order in a voice that brooked no argument. "We are done here. The measurements will suffice." We returned to the main camp at once. No one objected. As we shouldered our packs and instruments, I saw that Peterson's hands still shook. Anderson would not look toward the water. The journey back along the coast was a grim parody of our outward march. The dunes, which had seemed merely monotonous before, now felt like the backs of some vast, sleeping beasts. Every hollow held the possibility of that pale figure waiting just beyond sight. The sea's roar, once only a background to our work, now seemed a constant reminder of the night's events. We spoke little. When we did, it was of practical matters, the state of the instruments, the time we might expect to reach camp. No one mentioned what we had seen. It hung between us, unacknowledged yet inescapable. Once, as we passed a stretch of beach where the sand was still wet from the receding tide, I saw, far ahead, a line of prints upon the shore. They ran parallel to the waterline, long and narrow, each set at that same measured interval. Before I could call the others' attention to them, a wave surged higher than the rest and washed them away. At the main camp, we found everything as we had left it. The tent stood, the crates were undisturbed. Yet the air within the hollow felt somehow thinner, as if much had been breathed there in our absence. That evening, as we prepared a hasty meal, a fisherman from Sundevig came over the dunes, his cap in his hands. He had brought, he said, a message from the village. A storm was coming, worse than the last, and we would be wise to strike our camp and remove inland for a day or two. Rasmussen thanked him and pressed a coin into his hand. As the man turned to go, he hesitated, then looked back at us. "You have been upon the dead man's tongue," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," said Rasmussen shortly. "We have taken our measures there." The fisherman's gaze passed over our faces, lingering, I thought, upon the tightness around Peterson's mouth, the pallor of Anderson's cheeks. "My grandfather said there is one who walks there when the sea is high," he murmured. "White as a drowned man, but not drowned. It is best not to look upon him too long." "We saw no such thing," said Rasmussen too quickly. "We are men of science, not children to be frightened by tales." The fisherman bowed his head. "As you say," he replied. "Still, it is best not to look." He left us then, his figure soon lost among the dunes. We finished our meal in silence. That night we did not keep formal watch, but none of us truly slept. The storm the fisherman had warned of arrived after midnight, a great wall of wind and rain that flattened the dune grass and drove sand under the tent flaps. The sea advanced, its roar like artillery. More than once we felt the ground tremble faintly beneath us, as if something vast had shifted far below. In the morning, the sky was clear and the air washed clean. Our camp, though battered, still stood. Yet the beach below had altered. The line of high water was closer, and the dead man's tongue, far to the south, looked thinner, as if some great bite had been taken from it. Rasmussen gathered us. His face was set. "We have sufficient data," he said. "The additional refinements are not worth the risk of another storm upon this coast. We shall strike camp today and return to Ringkubing tomorrow." No one argued. The decision, though made in the language of prudence, was in truth an act of flight. The work of packing was a relief, a series of familiar tasks that allowed us to avoid one another's eyes. We crated the instruments with more care than usual, as if by attending to brass and glass, we might forget the pallid thing that had stood within arm's reach. That afternoon, as we loaded the cart that would carry our equipment inland, I found myself alone for a moment at the edge of the hollow, looking out toward the sea. The light was of that peculiar flat quality one sometimes sees after a storm, when every object seems outlined more sharply than usual. The water glittered. The line of surf was a white, unbroken curve. Then, for the space of perhaps 3 heartbeats, I saw it. Far down the coast, upon the narrow strand where the dead man's tongue met the sea, a pale figure walked. It moved with that same measured gait, 3 steps, a pause, 3 more, keeping always just at the edge of the foam. The distance was too great for detail, yet there was no mistaking the unnatural length of limb, the absence of clothing. No one else was watching. I could have called out, could have pointed, but some instinct, or perhaps some remnant of the fisherman's warning, held my tongue. I watched as it paced along the shore, never looking inland, until a bank of mist rolled in from the sea and took it from my sight. We left the coast the next day. The journey back to Ringkubing was uneventful, save for the persistent sense that we had turned our backs upon something that did not, in turn, turn its back upon us. At the Institute in Copenhagen, our return was received with the usual formalities. Instruments were checked, field books collected, expenses tallied. The director, a tall, spare man with a beard like a judge's, listened with polite attention as Rasmussen presented our findings. The corrected positions of certain sandbanks, the refined contours of the shoreline. Of the other matter, he said nothing. Neither did we at first. It was only when we sat together in the small office allotted to our team, preparing the official report, that the question could no longer be avoided. "We must decide," said Peterson, his hands folded upon the table, "whether to include any mention of what we saw. Rasmussen's jaw tightened. "We saw a man upon the shore," he said. "Perhaps diseased, perhaps deranged. We saw him in poor light in a place already dangerous. That is all." "That is not all," said Anderson quietly. "You heard it speak." Rasmussen's eyes flashed. I heard my own fear speak through the wind and the waves. Such things are not for the Institute's records. Peterson looked at me. "And you, Nielsen? You have the steadiest hand among us. What do you say we saw?" I thought of the pallid skin, the 2 long fingers, the way its mouth had formed words without understanding. I thought of the smoothed sand, the broken tripod, the sudden silences. "I do not know what we saw," I said at last, "only that it was not a man as we understand the term. Yet I also know that if we set it down in an official report, we shall be the object of ridicule, and our other work will be called into question. So we are agreed," said Rasmussen. He took up his pen. "We shall say nothing beyond what concerns the coast and its hazards. The rest we shall keep to ourselves." That is what we did. The report we submitted to the Institute made no mention of pale figures or smoothed sand. It spoke, instead of shifting bars, of the need for new buoys, of the danger to shipping in certain weathers. It was accepted, filed, and in due course incorporated into the Admiralty charts. In the months that followed, life resumed its accustomed pattern. There were other surveys, other coasts. I took a position of greater responsibility. Peterson's child was born, a healthy daughter, and he brought her photograph to the office, his face alight with pride. Anderson, restless, left the Institute to join a commercial mapping firm. Rasmussen tended his roses and spoke of retiring. Yet the thing upon the shore did not leave me. It returned in odd moments, unbidden. Once, walking along the harbour in Copenhagen on a foggy evening, I heard, beneath the slap of water against stone, a faint, measured tread that made my heart race until I realized it was only my own steps, echoing. Another time, in a lecture hall where a visiting scientist spoke of the newly theorized 4th dimension, I felt a chill as he described how a being from such a space might appear to us, distorted, its proportions wrong, its movements strange. I thought of the pale limbs, the eyes without colour, and wondered whether we had glimpsed not something supernatural, but something simply other. Years passed. I married, though late, and had no children. The Institute modernized new instruments, new methods. The old brass theodolites were retired to a cupboard. I seldom thought of the dead man's tongue by day. By night was another matter. There were dreams, at first infrequent, then more regular. In them I found myself again upon that narrow spit of land, the sea pressing in on every side. The lamp burned low, its light barely reaching my hands. Beyond its circle, something moved, always just out of sight. I would wake with the taste of salt in my mouth and the sound of that measured tread in my ears. Once, some 10 years after the expedition, I received a letter from Peterson, then posted to a survey in Iceland. His handwriting, usually so bold, was cramped. "Do you recall," he wrote, "our work upon the Jutland coast in 1908? Of course you do. How could one forget such storms? I ask. Because last week, upon a black sand beach near Vik, I saw, for a moment only, what I could swear was a figure like the one we saw then, pale, too tall, its gait too exact. When I looked again, it was gone. I told no one, of course. I am not mad, yet I thought you should know, if only so that I am not alone in my remembering," I wrote back, saying that I too remembered, that I too had seen things at the edge of sight. I did not tell him of the nights when I woke with my hand outstretched as if to ward off a touch. We never spoke of it in person. When next we met at a retirement dinner for Rasmussen, we confined ourselves to reminiscences of more ordinary hardships: broken axles, lost barometers, the time a cow had eaten our field books. Yet, in a quiet moment, as the others toasted our old chief, Peterson caught my eye and raised his glass, just a fraction, in a gesture that said more than any words. Rasmussen himself never referred to the matter. He retired to a small house outside Roskilde, where he tended his garden. When I visited him there once, some years before his death, I noticed that he had placed a strip of fine gravel all around the house, between the wall and the flower beds. "It keeps the slugs away," he said, seeing my glance. Yet I could not help but think of how clearly a footprint would show in such a strip. In my own house, in Oosterbro, I found myself developing small habits I could not entirely justify. I would check, before sleep, that there was a clear space of floor around my bed, free of rugs that might muffle sound. I took to hanging a coat upon the door in such a way that its shadow, cast by the street lamp outside, fell across the threshold. If that shadow ever changed, I told myself, I would know. Once, in the depth of winter, I awoke to a cold so intense that my breath smoked in the air. The stove had gone out, yet that alone did not account for the sharp, cellar-like chill. For a moment, I lay there, listening. The city was quiet under snow. Then I heard, faint but distinct, a sound from the street below. 3 steps, a pause, 3 more, upon the packed, frozen slush. I rose and went to the window. The glass was rimed with ice. Through it, I could see the street lamps, cone of light, the snow-banked gutters, the shuttered shops. No one walked there. Yet the sound came again, this time further along, as if whatever made it had passed my house and gone on. I told myself it was only some late labourer, his tread distorted by the cold. Yet I stood at the window long after the sound had ceased, watching the empty street. In the years since, I have read what I could find of coastal tales, of pale walkers and drowned men who do not drown. The fisherman's Blegmand appears in many guises, from Skagen to Esbjerg. Some say he is an omen of wrecks, others that he is a soul denied rest, pacing the boundary between sea and land. None of these explanations satisfy me, yet I cannot wholly dismiss them. I have also read, with a surveyor's curiosity, of phenomena at the margins of our understanding, of lights seen in uninhabited regions, of sounds heard where no source can be found. Men of science are quick to ascribe such things to refraction, to infrasound, to the quirks of the human brain under stress. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps what we saw upon the dead man's tongue was some rare combination of mist, moonlight, and fear. Yet when I recall the feel of that dry, cold touch upon my sleeve, the way its mouth formed the word "do not" in my own tongue, I find that such explanations ring hollow. I have told this full account only twice before now. Once to my wife, in the early years of our marriage, when some nightmare left me shaking, and she pressed me to say what spectre pursued me. She listened without interruption, her hand upon mine, then said only, "There are more things upon the shore than upon the sea." She never mentioned it again, yet sometimes when we walked together along the harbour, I saw her glance not at the ships, but at the narrow strip of wet stone where the water met the quay. The other time was to a young surveyor fresh from the Polytechnic, who came to me for advice before his first assignment to the Faroe Islands. He spoke eagerly of instruments, of baselines, of the satisfaction of reducing a wild coast to numbers. I envied him his innocence. As he rose to go, I said, "There is one more thing, Nielsen," for by coincidence he bore my own name. "Remember that not everything upon a coast may be measured. If you should see something that does not fit your angles and your chains, you may be tempted to ignore it. Do not, but also do not chase it too far. Some lines are not for us to survey." He laughed, thinking I spoke in jest, and thanked me. Perhaps, in time, he will come to understand what I meant. I hope he never has cause to. Now, in my 63rd year, with my hands too unsteady for fine work, and my days of field surveys long behind me, I find my thoughts returning more often to that night in 1908. Not with the raw fear of youth, but with a kind of weary curiosity. What was it that walked beside us on that shore? Some relic of an older world, left behind when the seas withdrew. Some being from a place that touches ours only at certain narrow margins, like the line of foam upon the sand. I do not know. I have come, at last, to accept that I may never know. The world is wider than our charts, and the coasts we draw are only the edges of what we can endure to think about. Yet there is one detail that troubles me still, more than any other. It is not the pallor of its skin, nor the unnatural length of its limbs, nor even the way it spoke. It is the fact that, in all the time it paced us along that moonlit shingle, it never once looked at the sea. It watched us. And sometimes, in the quietest hours before dawn, when the city is as hushed as that Jutland coast once was, I hear, very faintly, the sound of 3 soft steps, a pause, and 3 more, as if something patient and pale was still pacing a line just beyond the reach of the light.